The marsh had two moods, moving and not moving. Most days there was wind, even if it was small, just enough to comb the reeds, just enough to push scent across water, just enough to keep insects from owning every inch of skin. The reed beds would whisper and sway, and you could read the weather by the way their tips leaned. But on the morning this story begins, the reeds stood upright like they had been pinned. No rustle, no soft hiss, no ripple in the long green blades. The wind did not return. A rhinoceros walked the marsh edge alone, heavy enough that the ground seemed to notice each step. He moved along the firmest line of earth, where old hippo trails hardened into a narrow ridge between black water and mud. His ears rotated constantly, wide and round, gathering sound because sound was the only thing that travelled reliably when air was dead. He was a black rhino, smaller than the white rhinos tourists expected, but not small in any way that mattered. His body was compact and dense, built for pushing into thorn and brush. Dried mud clung to the folds behind his shoulder. The front horn was thick and worn, not a clean spike, but a blunt tool shaped by years of digging and fighting. There was a fresh scrape on his flank, pink under the grey hide, and a notch missing from one ear. He stopped at the edge of a reed bed and lowered his head. There was a gap in the reeds, not wide, not obvious, just a dark slit where stems had been bent aside, like someone had opened a curtain and walked through. It was the kind of opening animals created, hippos returning to water, buffalo pushing through, elephants making paths that became permanent. But this gap was new. The mud at its mouth was disturbed, flattened stems lay in one direction, not random, and the smell that drifted out of it was wrong. Old smoke, oil, human sweat dried into fabric. The rhino inhaled and held still. In still air, scent didn't scatter. It pooled. It stayed in pockets. It carried meaning. The rhino's nostrils flared again. His head lifted slightly, and his ears stopped rotating for half a second, pointing forward like dishes aimed at the gap. He took one step closer, then another. The reeds did not move. The water did not speak. Even the insects seemed quieter, as if they sensed something tense and didn't want to risk it. On the firm bank across the narrow channel, a man watched from the shade of a fever tree. His name was Joseph Kunda. He was a ranger with the wildlife unit, and he had been assigned to this section of marsh because poachers used it like a corridor. The reeds hid everything: people, snares, camps. Sound died in them. Tracks vanished in water. Joseph held binoculars to his eyes and kept his breathing slow. He knew that rhino. Not by name, rangers didn't name them in official reports, but by shape. This was the bull with the blunt horn. The one that liked the marsh edge when the heat was high. The one that didn't tolerate other bulls near his feeding lines. Joseph had seen him 2 weeks ago with a female at a salt patch. Calm, contained, not aggressive unless pressed. A rhino with routine. A rhino with predictable movement. Poachers loved predictable movement. Joseph had also found something 2 days earlier. A cut reed lane. A narrow reed gap that hadn't been there before. It wasn't wide enough for an elephant. It wasn't wide enough for a hippo. It was wide enough for a man to crawl, carrying steel. Joseph had radioed it in. The unit promised a sweep, but units were always short, fuel was always tight, and the marsh didn't wait for schedules. Now, watching the rhino approach the gap, Joseph felt the kind of unease that wasn't fear. It was knowledge arriving too late. He glanced downwind without thinking, then remembered. There was no wind. No wind meant no warning. The rhino entered the reed gap. His broad shoulders pressed stems aside with slow certainty. The reeds bent, scraped his hide, then sprang back behind him. In 2 steps, he became a moving grey shadow swallowed by green. Joseph shifted his weight, careful not to crack a branch or disturb dry leaves. He eased along the bank to keep sightlines through the reed wall. He couldn't see much. The rhino's passage made a low rubbing sound. Stems and body, water and mud. A heavy breathing, then nothing again. Joseph raised his radio to his mouth but hesitated. Calling for backup was obvious. But if poachers were in there, noise would send them running, and they would leave behind what they left behind: traps, wires, sometimes an animal already caught. Joseph watched the reed wall and listened. The marsh remained still, and then a sound so small it almost didn't exist, a metallic click, hidden under a reed scrape. Joseph's spine tightened. That wasn't a hippo, that wasn't water, that was human. He moved faster now, still silent, following the bank until he found the narrow crossing point where the channel thinned. He stepped into ankle-deep water, cold and black, and waded across. On the other side, he crouched, parting reeds carefully with his left hand, stick in his right. He saw the rhino, only partially. The rhino stood in the narrow corridor of pressed reeds, head down, sniffing the mud. His body was angled, uncertain for the first time, like he wanted to reverse but didn't want to show it. 20 meters beyond him, a thin wire ran low across the corridor, almost invisible, a snare line anchored to a stake, set at exactly the height to catch a leg. Joseph's throat went dry. The rhino took one step forward. The wire trembled. Joseph stepped out and shouted, one sharp, commanding sound. "Hey! Back!" The rhino jerked his head up, startled. He didn't charge Joseph. He didn't even move toward him. He simply froze, ears forward, reading the danger. The wire twanged slightly again as the rhino shifted weight. Joseph kept his voice loud and hard, the way you spoke to big animals when you needed them to choose a safer direction without thinking too long. "Back! Back, boy!" The rhino took a step backward, then another. The wire remained untouched. Joseph's heart hammered. He moved forward, eyes locked on the snare line, and reached it. His knife came out fast. He sliced the wire, then yanked it free and coiled it like a poisonous snake. He looked up. The rhino was still there, half hidden in reeds, staring. It wasn't gratitude in the animal's eyes. Animals didn't do gratitude like people wanted them to. It was attention. It was memory forming. Joseph lowered his voice, softer now, and stepped back to give the rhino space. The rhino snorted once and backed out of the reed gap, turning his body carefully so his horn didn't snag. When he emerged into open marsh edge light, his whole posture changed, shoulders lower, breath slower. He didn't run, he simply walked away, heavy and steady. Joseph stood in the corridor of reeds with the cut snare wire in his hand. He knew two things now. There were poachers close enough to set fresh wire, and without wind, every sound and smell would stay trapped in the reeds. The wind did not return. By afternoon, heat sat on the marsh like a blanket. The air was thick, the sky looked pale, drained. Reeds stood still, and the lack of movement made everything feel louder. Each insect buzz, each frog croak, each distant bird call. Joseph returned with a second ranger, a younger man named Elias, and a local tracker named Mosey who walked like the earth belonged to him. Mosey didn't carry binoculars. He carried attention. He crouched at the reed gap and studied the flattened stems, the mud, the broken wire Joseph had cut and bagged. This was set for him, Mosey said quietly. Elias frowned. How do you know? Mosey pointed with 2 fingers. The corridor is narrow, he said. Not for elephant, not for buffalo. It was cut to guide a heavy animal through one line, and the wire is new, still bright inside. He tapped the metal. They expected him today. Joseph looked at the reed gap with renewed anger. They're watching him, he said. Mosey nodded. And he is watching them now too. They entered the reed bed carefully, following the corridor. The marsh smelled of rot and green life. Water glinted between roots. Dragonflies hovered like small machines. The silence made Joseph tense. Wind usually covered your approach. It hid your sound in its own noise. Without wind, every step felt like a confession. Mosey moved ahead, scanning low. He found more signs. Boot prints in a patch of firmer mud, a crushed cigarette butt wrapped in wet paper, the faint smear of engine grease on a broken reed. Then he stopped and held up a fist. Joseph froze. Mosey pointed to a clump of reeds slightly off the corridor. Something dark was tied there, half submerged. Mosi reached in and pulled it out. A small radio handset, cheap and scratched, wrapped in plastic, dropped or hidden. Near it, a length of rope and a scrap of cloth that smelled of sweat and old smoke. Elias whispered, "They're close." Joseph nodded. They backed out and moved along the bank in a wide arc, scanning for camps or tracks leading to higher ground. The marsh had islands, small rises of firm earth where fever trees grew. Those were the places men used to rest, to cook, to wait. On the second island, they found a fire ring. Cold ash, a few bones from fish, and 2 empty water sachets. Not today, recently. Joseph crouched and picked up one sachet. The plastic was still soft, not sun-brittle. Mosi's voice was flat. "Tonight they return," he said. Joseph looked at the still reed line in the distance. "We'll be here," he replied. But "we" was a small word. It meant 2 rangers, 1 tracker, 1 radio that worked when it wanted to. The marsh was bigger than their manpower. They set up an observation point on a low rise with good views of the reed gap and the marsh edge path the rhino had used. As the sun dropped, the air cooled slightly, but the reeds stayed motionless. It was unsettling, like watching a face that refused to blink. The rhino returned near dusk. Joseph saw him first as a moving shadow along the marsh edge, then as the full body emerging from behind shrubs. He walked slowly, testing, stopping every few meters to sniff. He remembered the reed gap. He remembered the wire. He approached, but he did not enter. Instead, he stopped 10 meters from the gap and turned his head, sniffing the air as if trying to find a wind that wasn't there. Joseph felt a strange respect. The rhino wasn't clever like a human. He didn't understand snares, but he understood that the reed gap held danger. He shifted away, choosing a wider route along the open edge where the reeds didn't close in. Mosi murmured, "He learned." Elias whispered, "Good." But Joseph didn't feel relief. Not fully. Because learned animals sometimes did something else. They became harder to predict. Harder to protect. As darkness thickened, Joseph saw movement on the far side of the marsh. 2 men slipping along the reed line, staying low, wearing dull clothes that didn't catch moonlight. They moved with the quick confidence of people who had done this before. They carried something long and heavy. A rifle? A metal pole? Joseph couldn't tell. Mosi leaned closer, eyes narrowed. "Poachers," he breathed. Joseph lifted his radio and whispered coordinates. Static, then a broken response. Backup was hours away, if it came at all. The men approached the reed gap. They paused there, crouching, checking the corridor. Joseph watched them work. One man reached into the water and lifted the broken wire end Joseph hadn't fully removed. He'd cut the snare line, but the stakes remained. The man cursed silently, hands moving fast, rethreading wire with practiced motion. Joseph's jaw clenched. Elias whispered, "Take the shot." Joseph shook his head. "Too far, too dark. If we miss, they vanish." Mosi murmured, "If we wait, they set it again." Joseph's mind raced through risk and responsibility. If he charged in now, the poachers would flee and the snare might remain, ready for the rhino's next mistake. If he waited, he might catch them with proof, maybe stop them permanently. But the marsh didn't reward perfect plans. The rhino, meanwhile, began moving again, down the open edge route. Not toward the gap, toward the island, toward where Joseph and the others were hidden. Joseph's breath stopped. He wasn't coming to help. He wasn't coming because he knew rangers existed. He was coming because his route brought him here, because the marsh edge was a highway. Elias tightened his grip on his stick. Mosi's eyes widened. "If he smells us, he charges," he whispered. Joseph nodded slightly. A rhino's reaction wasn't attack or not attack, it was panic physics. A big animal deciding the fastest way to remove a threat was to hit it. The rhino approached within 30 meters. Joseph could hear his breathing, low and wet. He could see the deep grooves in his skin, the scar on his flank, the blunt horn angled slightly left. Still no wind, no scent carried away. Joseph knew the rhino would smell them soon. He raised his hand and signaled, "Stay still." The rhino paused, his head lifted, his nostrils flared. He had them. The reeds stayed frozen. The whole marsh seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the reed gap, a sudden metallic clatter. One of the poachers dropped a tool. The sound snapped the rhino's attention sideways. His head turned sharply. His ears pivoted toward the gap like radar. Joseph's heart hammered. The rhino was now aware of two threats. One hidden, one noisy. The rhino snorted, stamped once, and, without charging Joseph, he moved fast toward the sound. Not a full run, but a heavy, urgent trot that made mud jump. Joseph's eyes widened. "No," he whispered. Elias breathed. "He's going in." Mosey's voice was tight. "He will go to the gap." And that's what he did. The rhino angled toward the reed corridor, the very place he had avoided minutes ago, because in still air, sound became a compass, and the reed gap was now the loudest place in the marsh. The rhino hit the reed line with his shoulder, pushing stems aside like they were grass. The corridor swallowed him again. Joseph didn't have time to debate. If that rhino stepped into a reset snare, the marsh would turn into a trap with no clean exit. A snared rhino didn't simply get caught. It fought the wire until flesh opened. It tore itself trying to pull free. It ran blind with pain and panic, crashing through reeds and water, and poachers followed the blood trail until the animal collapsed. Joseph ran. Elias and Mosey ran behind him. They moved low and fast, using the bank, then cutting into the reeds at the corridor mouth. The smell inside was thick. Green rot, mud, old smoke, and now the sharp animal musk of rhino fear. Ahead, voices, human whispers, urgent. Joseph raised his rifle but kept it down. Reeds blocked visibility. He could not shoot safely, not at shadows. A sudden crash echoed through the corridor. Reeds snapping, water slapping. The rhino had met something. Joseph pushed forward and saw it. The snare line had been reset, lower and tighter, anchored with stronger stakes. The rhino had not stepped into it yet. He stood with one forefoot lifted, frozen at the edge of the line as if his body sensed tension in the air even without understanding wire. His head swung left and right, horn carving space, breathing fast. 10 meters beyond the snare, two men crouched behind reeds, startled by how quickly the animal had returned. One held a coil of wire. The other held a heavy rifle with a worn stock. Poachers. They had expected quiet work. They did not expect a rhino to arrive like a storm. Joseph shouted, loud enough to break the corridor's hush. "Drop it! Hands up!" The men jerked. The one with the rifle lifted it instinctively. Elias yelled too, voice cracking with adrenaline. Mosey didn't shout. He moved, fast, sideways, disappearing into reeds to flank them. The rhino, hearing the shouting, snapped into motion. He lunged backward, 1 step, 2, then spun in the narrow corridor, horn scraping reed stems, body brushing the snare line so close the wire vibrated. Joseph's stomach dropped. "Back! Back!" he roared at the rhino, as if the animal could understand. The rhino didn't understand words, but he understood pressure. He chose the only open direction, forward, past the snare line. His front leg came down, the wire caught, not fully around the ankle, but enough to bite. The rhino jolted, startled by the sudden tug. He surged forward again, and the snare tightened hard around his leg like a metal mouth. The sound that came out of him was deep and ugly, pain and confusion. He charged forward, dragging the stake. The poachers scattered instantly. The rifleman stumbled backward, falling into water. The other man ran, splashing. The rhino, blind with panic, drove through the corridor, stake bouncing, wire slicing into his leg. Joseph's head went hot. He sprinted to the snare anchor point and dropped to his knees, hands working. He yanked at the stake. too deep. He pulled his knife and started cutting, but the wire was thick, designed not to break. Elias knelt beside him, breath ragged. "Cut the line! Cut it!" Joseph saw the angle. The wire ran taut into the reeds ahead, pulled by the rhino's movement. Cutting it here would release tension, but leave the loop on the rhino. Still dangerous, still a wound. But it would stop the animal from dragging the anchor and ripping itself open deeper. Joseph didn't hesitate. He hacked at the wire with everything he had, knife scraping, hands shaking. Elias grabbed a rock and slammed it down on the wire to pin it, helping Joseph saw. Metal whined. Finally, the wire snapped. The tension released violently, whipping back into reeds. Joseph's hands stung. Blood ran from a small cut on his palm where the wire had kissed him. But the rhino was no longer tethered. Ahead in the reeds, the rhino crashed away, still with a tightened loop on his leg, but now able to move without dragging the stake. That mattered. Now the animal had a chance to survive long enough for treatment. Joseph stood, chest heaving, and lifted his radio. "Rhino snared, partial release, need vet team now," he barked, voice hard. "Poachers present, 2, 1 rifle, moving east through reeds." Static answered, then finally a clearer voice. "Copy, units en route." Joseph didn't trust en route. He trusted what he could see. Mosi reappeared from the reeds behind the poachers, moving like a shadow with purpose. He grabbed the rifleman as the man tried to stand, twisting his arm, forcing him down. The second poacher vanished into the reeds like smoke. Elias moved to help, keeping the captured man pinned. Joseph ran forward to the edge of the corridor where it opened slightly and scanned for the rhino. He caught glimpses of grey hide between green stems, moving fast and erratic. The rhino was running now, away from everything, away from pain, away from the trap. Joseph's throat tightened. He had saved the animal from the worst outcome, but not from injury. He whispered, more to himself than anyone, "Hold together." The reeds stood still. No wind came to cool the marsh. No movement came to soften the moment. The air remained dead, making every breath feel heavy. Hours later, the vet team arrived in a helicopter that made the reeds bow under its rotor wash, the first real wind the marsh had seen all day. For a moment, the reed bed moved again, bending and hissing, alive with motion. Then the helicopter lifted away, and the air fell dead once more. They found the rhino at dusk, exhausted, lying in shallow mud near an island. He was alive. His breathing was heavy. His eyes were half closed. The snare loop had cut deep, but not through bone. The vet worked quickly. Dart, approach, cut, treat, wrap, antibiotics. Joseph stood at the edge of the scene, watching the thick skin and the delicate vulnerability under it, watching how easily a life that powerful could be reduced to a wire. When the rhino finally rose, slow, stiff, but standing, Joseph felt his chest loosen for the first time in hours. The animal did not look at him. It didn't need to. It limped away into reeds, choosing distance over understanding. As darkness fell, Elias asked quietly, "Why didn't the wind come back?" Joseph didn't answer immediately. He looked at the reed gap, the narrow corridor that had almost become a death sentence. Then he said, "Sometimes the land goes still before something breaks," he replied. Elias swallowed. And now? Joseph watched the marsh settle again, reeds upright, water smooth. "Now we close the gap," he said. "We cut new paths for the rhino, wide ones, safe ones. We patrol harder." Mosi nodded once. "And the men?" Joseph looked at the captured poacher, hands tied, face blank with fear and anger. "One ran," Joseph said. "He'll come back. They always do." Elias stared at the reeds. "So the story isn't finished." Joseph's eyes stayed on the still water. "No," he said, "but tonight the rhino walks." The reeds remained quiet, and even when darkness cooled the marsh, the wind did not return. except in the sound of rotor blades fading into distance and the heavy limping steps of an animal that survived because someone reached him before the wire won.